Welcome everybody to the online annual lecture series. Um, Thank you so much for joining us. The point of this series is for you, the Worcester alumni, to hear about the work that especially the younger scholars at Worcester are doing, and delighted to welcome our today's speaker, Dr. Max Lau, whom I'll introduce in a second. Just a word more on the series itself. The college is committed to providing more resources for younger scholars in their careers. Um, we aim to create more opportunities for postgraduates. The funding for postgraduates, and maybe don't need me to tell you, is in a parlor state, and anything we can do is a plus. So we're looking to increase the number of graduate scholarships we offer, and also the funding for more early career academics like Max. To find out more about how to support these projects, please look at our website, which will be shown on the final slide of the presentation, or get in touch with Development and Alumni Relations team. Should say, introduce myself. I'm fellow and tutor here in history in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and I'm delighted to welcome Max. Max is a global historian in many senses. His career begins here at Oxford and then go via Japan, brings him back to Oxford, happily here at Worcester, where he's a junior research fellow. Um, his work, the center of his work is on the Byzantine Empire, and that's going to be the topic of his talk to us today. I commend to you his recent book, Emperor John II Komnenos, Rebuilding New Rome. But let's say that on the global front, he's the co-investigator in a AHRC funded project, Noblesse Oblige, Barons and the Public Good in Medieval Afro-Eurasia. Gives you some idea of the breadth of his vision. Um, and I very much look forward to hearing what he's going to tell us with the enigmatic title, Byzantium, New Endor. Max, let me hand the floor to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the overly kind introduction, and also to everyone today for tuning into this, and equally for people after this lecture has even been given who are watching the recording. I will just share my PowerPoint with you all. And rather than sort of going into an introduction, I'm actually just going to go straight into a sort of immediate anecdote to give you a kind of flavor for what you've tuned in for. So let me present to you immediately what is often called the optical telegraph system of Leo the mathematician. Who is Leo the mathematician, you may ask, or quickly be Googling, why haven't I heard of him? Main thing here is that none of his works actually survive. We only know of him through secondhand sources. Apparently a great mathematician who discovered lots of things, and yet it seems we may never know unless we discover some lost sources. To give you a quick idea for what we're talking about here, I mean, I stole this image, the sharp-eyed amongst you may notice, from The Lord of the Rings, where you have the sort of lighting of the beacons seen across all of these mountains. And effectively, what we're looking at is the real version of those. You can see on the map there, you've got more or less from your kind of greater Syrian border at the Cilician Gates, a beacon system across all of what is now Turkey, all the way to the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople. This, needless to say, was a very sophisticated piece of kit. You can see, obviously, they're much more closely clustered, sort of as you go through Bithynia here, more mountainous region, much more difficult to see at various points. Whereas, obviously, in your long sort of open plains of central Anatolia, they can be much further apart. This isn't no mere let's light the beacons and that's one message. You had water clocks, sort of dripping, basically sort of dead on time, synchronized to each other. And effectively, you could pass different messages based on what exact hour you actually sent these things over. This also depicts the main line. I mean, there were several other basically sort of sidelines. You could send messages, over to Ephesus, up to the north coast, to various naval bases as you liked. This was the fastest possible way you can send any sort of message, more or less until the telegraph system in modern day at this point, or generously maybe the semaphore system set up during things like the Napoleonic Wars here in England. So I've opened with this sort of particular anecdote, mainly because I usually pose it as a question. The sort of a couple of times I've given a lecture similar to this, as this was set up under Emperor Theophilus. He's known as sort of a lawgiver, that kind of thing. But it was disbanded virtually immediately by his successor. And I usually throw open sort of to the room why exactly did they give up this very sophisticated piece of kit? I mean, obviously, going through this from the imperial post system by horse was going to take, a week at best. By sea, probably more or less the same most of the time. This is a real problem, not to mention you can send messages the other way. So why exactly did they give this up? And usually I get answers. I mean, I've given this exact anecdote to Shriven Defense College, for example, and I had various things about the cost, not to mention, I mean, the soldiers who saw this thought, actually hanging out on one of these mountains for an extended period of time is probably nobody's idea of a nice posting. So, problem basically with personnel. And the answer, we've had a few different answers given in sources. And the main one that actually comes out is that whenever they actually used this system, Constantinople rioted. Everyone immediately panicked that, the Arabs are raiding, everything was going downhill, they were being invaded, the equivalent of, stock exchange crash, everything else. Equally, there's one particularly hostile source that Michael III, the emperor, gave it up because it interfered with his chariot racing, and everybody was suddenly so preoccupied with geopolitics that actually they weren't, actually paying any attention to him on the chariot racing course. That is one particularly hostile source. So I throw this open more or less to everyone listening as an interesting example of a way to look at history. Because here you have a massive technological advantage that due to sociological factors, they gave up. It wasn't worth knowing these things sooner because if your capital is going to riot every single time. And Byzantium, I think, basically comes up with a number of these different examples, which I'm going to share with you today in order to basically give you a different way of looking at either contemporary events or other historical periods in a new light. My slightly enigmatic title I will come to right at the end. Maybe some of you have some idea for why I've called the talk New Endor, but don't worry, I will share right at the end. So to introduce us as my paper as a whole, really this is a series of sort of interesting anecdotes in some ways, which will all reflect on something of either contemporary relevance or alternatively introduce a little bit of some of the teaching I and colleagues do to basically whichever period of history or in life really that you may end up sort of working in, a different way of looking at something which you can explore through Byzantium. Now, admittedly, if ever an era basically really deserved a little bit of a potted history so that you've got something to hang the rest of your timeline off, it's probably Byzantine history. Some of you on this call may know all of this already, in which case bear with me. But more or less in about the next 5, maximum 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a potted kind of 1500 years of history, just so you've got some sort of timeline to work on. And I'll do this mainly through these maps you see in front of you here and on the next slide. So your 337 AD at the top left there, this is more or less your emperor, this is your empire under Constantine. Some of you may have seen Gladiator 2 recently. Also remember your classical Roman Empire is more or less still up and running nicely at this point. Sure, it's given up sort of Dacia, these sort of things, and Constantine's introduced Christianity and moved the capital to Constantinople, sort of on the Bosphorus, modern Istanbul. A lot of this is in response to kind of various pressures the empire has come under, both internal and external. One of the sort of central essays of those who study late antiquity will be told is, could they really have kept this whole thing together? Your solution in some ways was to have junior emperors and senior emperors, so that effectively there is, rather than fighting each other as to who is emperor, and equally you have somebody who can lead an army, because you have a central problem throughout more or less all of history, is that how do you defend your borders with somebody who more or less could turn the army back on the capital? I mean, it's no accident that, say, for example, the Tudor family, who end up, winning your Wars of the Roses and everything else, are your Welsh border stock, the Mortimers before this kind of thing. You need to give troops to somebody to defend your borders. And then at some point they think, maybe I should just march the other way and take over the capital. And the capital is where your king or emperor or whatever has to sit. Your Chinese solution, of course, is always to have, to really sort of pull the teeth of your generals and to make sure that you have these civil servants above. Anybody on this call who may remember the, say, animated version of the sort of Disney's Mulan may remember the sort of civil servant with the ridiculous hat, who basically is forever sort of, holding the general back from actually doing anything useful against the Mongols. This, of course, is a stereotype, but it does mean that your Chinese generals don't tend to march on the Chinese capital. This more or less is your Roman solution. Let's get more emperors and hope for the best. However, as I said, it does tend, as I said, to fall apart, and they continuously have civil wars, such that eventually, and having to get more mercenaries in and everything else, such that eventually your fall of Rome occurs. It is, of course, debatable as to what extent this is internal, external. Leave that to you to, sort of research yourselves. But eventually you end up with a sort of Eastern Roman Empire, more or less divided at your sort of Dalmatian coast and North Africa there. However, then you end up with your reconquests under Justinian and Theodora, which is my second map, 550. Again, a classic sort of essay question often given is basically whether these were worth it. As it seems, maybe this would be better spent fighting the other superpower, Persia, at the eastern frontier. And so those looking ahead think, well, this is eventually where the threat's going to come from, with the sort of rise of Islam, the Arabic invasions. Maybe rather than spending all this money reconquering Italy, a bit of Spain and North Africa, they could have done just keeping the money there. However, equally, it depends on what your idea of empire is here. Because, I mean, a lot of what Justinian may have gained here were trading rights, favorable religious policy, something that looks much more like, say, a modern sphere of influence. If you think of your sort of Chinese Belt and Road policy, what lots of your major nations, both sort of in America or China, are doing in Africa, this is the sort of thing that seems Justinian is doing in lots of the rest of the Roman Empire, even if there isn't the same territorial empire going on. And so, again, this is a sort of very interesting period to look at on this level. But as I said, another generation later, you do have your rise of Islam after your major war between Persia and Byzantium, knocks out both superpowers such that there is a bit of a power vacuum. And as I said, your sort of caliphate moves in and takes over everything all the way to sort of Spain, sort of off this map in the bottom left corner there, and then towards Afghanistan and such on the right, finally bringing down sort of Persia. Through a series of luck in some ways, use of naval power, and sort of this thing called the thematic system with sort of localized armies that, ambushed sort of raiding forces on the way back. Byzantium narrowly limps through this period. I mean, they even put sort of God help the Romans on their coins, which if you put that in your money, then this is quite dire times. They just managed to hold on, as you can see there, and then steadily start expanding through the 9th century onwards, such as by 1025, they've actually sort of got to this, sort of they're more or less reaching back into Syria, these sorts of areas here, as the Islamic world starts breaking up and all the rest of it. This doesn't last very long, as soon after, however, the Turks show up. Equally, you have various sort of the Normans start sort of running around conquering lots of countries as well as England, sort of in southern Italy, and you have a major sort of crisis on the hand, which only sort of Alexius I Komnenos sort of comes in around this period, and it eventually makes this appeal to the West. I refer to sort of my colleague at Worcester, Peter Frankopan's book, A Call from the East, his first one, if you want to read up more on this. And sort of, and with the sort of help of the Crusaders, Byzantium is able to reconquer an area such that by the later 12th century, you have this map at the top right, with again a lot more of that empire of 1025 reconquered. However, you then sort of have this sort of growth of, sort of essentially Western interest, trade, everything else in the empire, something I'm going to talk towards the end of this, this lecture about, such this eventually sort of lures over the sort of the armies of the Fourth Crusade, who eventually end up sacking Constantinople and installing this Latin Empire, as it's called in 1204, which leads to various successor states down here, which do, however, eventually reconquer the capital, such that by 1250, you have it being restored yet again. After this point, however, a series of civil wars result, further Turkish invasions, and indeed the rise of sort of Serbia and Bulgaria sort of over in the west, and this eventually leads to the end of Byzantium in 1453. Timing me, that is a good 1500 years of history in fairly short order. Hopefully you've all kept up with that with all of these maps. So, a little bit about what I do. This slightly grainy photograph is, if you look up sort of lots of these Byzantine fortifications, what you tend to find. This is a little place called Ankaras, which is sort of in Western Turkey these days. And effectively during my own doctorate, I mean, I was reading all of these texts that said things like, oh, the emperor built a fortress. And I was like, great, okay, the emperor built a fortress. But, what exactly is this thing? Is it a massive invasion-stopping fortress? Is it built quickly on a budget? Is it sort of, monumental, designed to stay around? Is it guarding a town, a river, a road? Is it a glorified watchtower? Is it there for economic reasons? The emperor built a fort doesn't actually tell me very much, not to mention who lives there, everything else. And so in order to more or less find out more, effectively, I had to go visit these things myself. I was blessed a very good tutor, sort of Mark Whitto. Maybe some of you were also tutored by him in various things, who effectively said, well, you're going to have to go and do it. And so I had some very generous support, as I said, for bursaries and things in order to kind of travel out there and investigate these things. The one book, which was written in the 80s with photos taken in the 60s and 70s, had pictures like this. And it said things like, just to the south of the village of Bellicosia. Bellicosia is now a huge modern city. And so where exactly is this thing? Series of interesting events later, and effectively, I do manage to eventually find these sorts of things. In this particular case, this is on the edge of a hydroelectric dam these days. The sort of gently rolling hills you saw in the last slide no longer exist as they're filled with water. And you have to make some interesting kind of, shall we say, inquiries and pay interesting entrance fees of the guards of the hydroelectric dam in order to get any access to this place. And so this was the sort of slightly more adventurous side of what I managed to do during my doctorate in order to put these things together. Most of a decade later, I managed to produce this map. I mean, this is sort of from my recent book. It's interesting the way they decided to label it. The Fortress of John, you can see in red at the bottom there, or City of John, are ones that sort of the emperor I study founded specifically, whereas some of the black ones there, or cities, are existing cities that existed before he went around founding places. I managed to find that effectively what you really have going on here is that you have an empire that was really on all fronts, but is now trying to re-embed itself back into the landscape with a sort of network of small fortresses that in and of themselves aren't going to stop any sort of major invasion, but which are mutually supportive, equally are great for sort of tolls and trade, and aren't creating some sort of nomad's land, but are actually sort of really sort of trying to re-embed Byzantium back into the landscape that had been sort of overrun with various invading powers. There's a similar map over to the west, though, as my lecture got far too long when I included the Balkans as well. But otherwise, if you want to see what most of a decade's worth of field work looks like, it's this map. So now for something a little different, though, as I said, what I just talked about for a few minutes is going to link up to this in an interesting way in a second. So this article from The Atlantic was one of The Atlantic's most read articles of about sort of 2015. I've got these sort of interesting here. So you've got here sort of what ISIS really wants, which is written by Graham Wood. He basically sort of had this big old argument that said that kind of what ISIS really wants was based on this sort of apocalyptic reading of various hadiths in particular, and that there would be a sort of major battle apparently at a place called Dabiq. This is in modern day Syria. It's a little village, and that really what they were trying to do by being, as I said, in particular things like the beheadings, all of the sort of awful, horrific things that they were sort of running the entire time, was effectively in order to lure the West to Dabiq so that they could have this final battle. Was apparently in the hadiths, and you can see this particularly on the next slide. You have this particular line which says that this will basically force that all of the faithful to rally around them, and that this would therefore lead to the final battle, etc. Equally, then sort of Jesus would apparently show up wearing yellow for some reason, and that this would more or less lead to the final triumph of everything here. As I said, I'll leave that up for a little second. Though on my previous slide, you saw Dabiq therefore became the sort of the name of the fairly slickly produced propaganda material of sort of the Islamic State. And this was a real sort of thing either for recruitment of sort of fighters from various different places, and then also, as I said, to sort of keep everybody inspired that this is what we were doing here. Now, this article, as it had a lot of interesting responses. One of the most interesting one was from the Huffington Post, which basically sort of had an interesting line from someone who probably should remain nameless, actually, that said, oh, okay, if this is what ISIS really want, then let's send in the Royal Marines, the Navy SEALs, they can bring whoever they want, and let's have this out. Kind of thing, which obviously was not particularly diplomatic in any way. And this was really sort of, anteing up on every possible side. In fact, on my next slide, you can see you've got, again, this sort of big sort of reference to sort of Crusader armies. I mean, this is all sort of ISIS propaganda. Be careful if you Google this stuff. Bringing all this in. What all of this sort of, and this debate really came quite sort of heated sort of online, and obviously you had sort of more moderate voices on every side saying, please calm it down, everything else, all in about sort of 2015. Well, lots of this debate was lacking was the fact that this wasn't actually the last time the Crusaders, the Westerners, or indeed, as you saw probably on the previous side, the Romans, who obviously are the stand-in for the Westerners, had been at Dabiq. Actually, this had been occurring during the 12th century. So here's a quick map I sort of did for my original thesis, actually, so which explains it's a little bit sort of more primitive than the previous one I had done for my book, which roughly shows where both Dabiq and Alamak, which is also mentioned in that hadith, are on sort of roughly both modern day and medieval Syria. So during the 12th century, you had this guy called Muhammad ad-Din Zengi. Zengi is one of your main inspirations for both Al-Qaeda and then also sort of IS after them, particularly this gent here, Abu Musab al-Zuqari, who sort of seen in a sort of usual sort of video. He basically was one-time Al-Qaeda number 3. He was head of operations in Iraq, leader of the anti-American insurgency there, was known as the Sheikh of the Slaughterers until his death in 2006. And he was effectively one of the main architects of kind of, the sort of, I say, sort of intellectual side of the Islamic State. He basically had Zengi as his hero. Zengi also sort of began as Atabeg, the sort of chief of Mosul, which obviously ended up as sort of Daesh's capital. And then he also went on to seize Aleppo and Hama in modern Syria, again, mirroring more or less exactly the rise of IS a few years ago. He then became the first ruler to drive the Crusaders back. And he did this in a way that, is the sort of thing that IS very much approved of. I put one particular passage sort of on the screen there that's really sort of set the tone. Unlike, say, sort of Saladin, who obviously is acclaimed in the West for basically treating his prisoners very well, for being very sort of courteous, a model of chivalry, regardless of religion, Zengi was not. To say the least. He very much sort of had the rule by fear sort of thing. This is what comes through in our sources anyway. So far, so medieval, inverted commas. It seems as if, both the so-called Islamic State and all the commentators are correct in likening, IS to kind of return of the barbarous horrors of the Middle Ages, quote unquote, again, from that article. Except, as I said, this story of Christian crusaders against Islamic jihadis was never as clear-cut in either the Western Christian or Islamic historians, medieval or modern, actually wrote, as your sort of major player is left out of this, Byzantium, the actual Romans. And so rather than talking about the Romans being a stand-in for the West or referring to crusaders, actually there were actual Romans still running around Byzantium when, as I said, Zengi was actually campaigning. Coming back to my map here, this is particularly interesting during the period I study in the 12th century, as John II Komnenos, having, as I said, retaken a number of areas, was campaigning in exactly this area of Dabiq and Alamak. And Zengi was round Aleppo, for sort of around here as well. At various points, they were only about sort of one day's march away from each other. And yet it seems that none of our commentators talk about this titanic battle that surely would happen. I mean, you have, the emperor of the Romans, the arch-Christian, with, your sort of, absolute sort of paragon of jihadis who would later throw the Crusaders back, more or less, with their armies all being right next to each other, and yet no battle, which is interesting to say the least. And it seems that everyone just glosses over that, both Christian sources and Islamic sources. This, however, is where one particularly obscure source does come in. There is one particular commentator called Ibn Munkid, Usama ibn Munkid, who describes himself as the gentleman of Damascus. He is from the sort of family of one of the ruling families who gets kicked out by the sort of Zengi and his family. So he's pretty anti-Zengi. Fair enough, he gets kicked out of town. But equally, he then travels the world. He writes a number of different sort of works of advice. He mentions he has Christian Jewish friends as well as enemies, likewise Muslims. I mean, he comes across anyway as I said, this gentleman of Damascus sort of traveling the world. And he specifically mentions that, oh yeah, while I was there as a young man, Zengi and the Emperor John II shared a love of hunting. They exchanged sort of gifts of hunting birds in particular, and various embassies while they were so close to each other, rather than actually fighting. He just mentions this as a by the by, yet this is supported in assorted small texts such as the Armenians and Jewish sources, that actually embassies have exchanged, and effectively, though no treaty was actually agreed, your sort of, proto-crusader and proto-jihadi at this time actually were getting along very, very well. The main thing really we seem to be talking about is that prior to your massive invasions of the Turks in the 11th century and the real reshaping of this part of the world then, your dividing line around here had been very stable for quite a few hundred years. And then actually what we seem to be deciding here is that actually they're carving it up between them and really coming up with a modus vivendi. And that actually possibly loads of these, as shall we say, atrocities that Zengi is attributed to maybe are actually designed in order to recruit not only IS fighters in the 21st century, but also, as I said, 12th and 13th century jihadis at that point. And that likewise, so the Christian sources are, again, sort of really sort of pumping up the octane of all of this in order to recruit crusaders, which indeed inspire some of your reactions to this IS propaganda in the 21st century in the same way. And that at the time, actually, these people were much more reasonable and were looking for a way forward and peace. And you can see this also with, as I said, the building projects they were carrying out, as all around this area, which I did lucky enough to do field work in, particularly sort of around the Turkish borders, around Antioch, this sort of area, you have, as I said, a lot of not only fortresses, but monasteries, churches, bridges, new harbors, all of this being built. And likewise, Zengi, far from necessarily being the man massacring everyone all over the place, seems to be really patronizing schools, fortifications, infrastructure, in another word, in all of these areas, whereas both of them shy away from doing it in these borderlands. And so therefore, the argument comes in that actually your sort of inspiration for IS, indeed some of your inspiration for your sort of crusade rhetoric from the West, actually really were trying to get along. This is a paper I then published in 2015, which then got shared a bunch with sort of various policy makers and things. And so I'd like to say anyway, this was my very small, very, very small part in taking away the intellectual, shall we say, argument for the Islamic State. So that's sort of one sort of slightly one connecting my own research with what's been happening more recently. To take my sort of next little anecdote as we move through, I want to talk a little bit about then sort of 12th century Constantinople and the empire in particular. And hopefully sort of as I talk, you'll realize sort of what I'm getting at for, shall we say, the why certain economic situations lead to certain governments being elected. So 12th century Byzantium, obviously we saw before how they'd lost a fair bit of territory to the Normans, to the Turks, and therefore looking to really jumpstart the economy. At this point, they therefore let in lots of these Italian traders, the Venetians, the Genoese, the Pisans in particular. These are your big multinationals of the day. They're able to transport goods all over the place. Equally, they have various innovative, ways of doing things. And they are given more or less exactly the same tax break as Amazon, Google, lots of these big multinationals are given today. There is a sort of 20% sort of ad valorem kind of, tax for anybody who's into this kind of stuff when it comes to commercial taxes, which effectively they are excused, in particular in the capital, but also in other major cities. Thessaloniki, that sort of thing. They therefore set up shop in these places, much like these big multinationals set up shop in your major cities or indeed specific countries today. This led to places like Constantinople, Thessaloniki becoming intensely wealthy. Likewise, the government bringing in a lot more revenue than what they had previously, even when they had more territory in the past. This they then spent on usually lots of these sort of prestige wars in places like the Balkans, the Crimea, Syria. And as I said, these areas became increasingly cosmopolitan. I mean, in Constantinople in the 12th century, you have various sources talking about they had separate rival Jewish quarters coming from different parts of Europe. Likewise, you had more than one mosque and different Islamic communities actually in Constantinople. You equally had apparently sort of Ethiopian, Nubian quarters, those from sort of sub-Saharan Africa even as all basically sort of in this one particular city. Which, with the exception probably of sort of the capital of China at this point, was probably the largest city in the world, when places like Paris, London were kind of maybe 20,000 people. Anyone who's been to Paris, I mean, literally you're sort of Ile de Paris with, Notre Dame on it. I mean, that is all of Paris at this point, whereas this is, really a true sort of megalopolis. The interesting thing for this is that, sure, these cities got intensely wealthy, but a lot of the rest of Byzantium around it did not see any benefit from this whatsoever. Indeed, their native, inverted commas, merchants ended up being outcompeted quite a lot. How can, as I said, your sort of standard sort of Greek-speaking merchant of Byzantium compete with somebody who doesn't need to pay a 20% tax? This is really quite difficult in order to sort of hold your own unless you're working in partnership with somebody, which a lot of them do. And therefore, it means that actually increasingly a lot of your trade and exchange is put in the hands of these Italians. Likewise, diplomatically, you have increasing amount of emperors marrying sort of Western princesses, and indeed lots of your top nobility all do the same. You have cultural changes. You have sort of jousting occurring apparently in sort of the hippodrome where chariot racing happened. You have therefore a lot of these sort of very, very global elites coming in Constantinople in particular. This all comes to a head in the 1180s, where you have a child emperor on the throne. His mother is a sort of Western princess, who then, in order to kind of survive over there, gets a lot of other Westerners around her as her sort of cabinet. Therefore, you end up with, as I said, your Byzantine Empire being run by these sort of elites and foreigners, increasingly out of touch with a lot of the rest of the people here, due, as I said, in no small part to these economic and diplomatic reasons. This leads to this guy called Andronicus, who is a sort of very minor imperial prince, coming to the fore. He sells himself as this sort of great general and very, very rich, although actually looking at his sort of CV before this point, he seems to have been a pretty poor governor, definitely a very poor general. But even so, he sort of sells himself as this sort of great Byzantine exemplar. And in his sort of relatively old age, I mean, he's about 60 at the time, he sort of really starts calling on these sort of elites and foreigners, really, as I said, are the cause of all of these sort of Byzantine woes. And really, they need to go to the capital and purge the place of all of these sort of decadent people in order to really sort of bring Byzantium back to where it should be. Hopefully, this is all sounding a little bit familiar to a lot of you. Andronicus has this march on the capital. There's no battle or anything. He's let in. He is made head of the Regency Council. He then steadily sort of purges lots of these other Westerners. Even though he plays them sort of off against each other, I mean, he sort of has lots of diplomatic sort of embassies to Venice, saying how much he likes Venice, whilst at the same time leading pogroms and anti kind of Venetian sentiment in the capital. And effectively, what I'm saying here is that you do seem to have a sort of an economic situation leading to a massive gap between, as I said, these sort of very rich cosmopolitan cities and the rest of the country around it, which tends to lead to these sort of similar populist rulers being elected. This then leads to the obvious comparison on my next slide, which is that Sir Andronicus Komnenos and Sir Donald Trump seem to have very similar impetuses in order to get elected. This is the most Byzantine picture I could find with the carvings next to him there. I'm not really a history repeats itself kind of guy. Obviously, sort of Mark Twain had the famous line that, it doesn't repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And really what I'm saying here is that similar basically patterns do tend to lead to similar-ish outcomes. And there seems to be one of those cases in Byzantium going forward as well. And therefore, it is worth reflecting on that, giving, as I said, Amazon a tax break is not necessarily a moral failing. It doesn't necessarily lead, regardless of your politics, to, as I said, the election of populist leaders. But it is worth thinking about these sorts of dynamics and what that does to a nation. So this brings me, as I said, to my last major slide here, where I'm going to bring up my slightly enigmatic title. So obviously, for those some of you may have guessed already, this is a sort of 19th century Russian painting of the Witch of Endor, the story of sort of King Saul, who those of you know your Bible studies, who before the battle sort of consults sort of a necromancer to bring up the sort of spirit of the dead, so he knows what's going to happen, and then the prophet Samuel says, "Well, you're going to be doomed here." And effectively, it's one of those odd things where Byzantium is often called upon as this sort of interesting parallel, because like in some ways, I mean, I spent a lot of time over in Tokyo, and there, I mean, it is obviously very, very modern, but it's modern in a slightly different way to the rest of the world, where lots of countries tend to have westernized as they progressed. Japan didn't. In a very similar way, you have sort of Byzantium as a very different to the medieval West or to the Islamic world, and different things going on. But reflections upon these can, as I said, lead to very interesting conclusions as to how we should see the contemporary world, or indeed other aspects of history. And looking at it sort of, whether it comes to minority, majority sources, as I sort of used for the Zengi example, or indeed sort of looking at sort of economics and historical dynamics, both for my initial example with the optical telegraph system or the election of populist leaders, leads to a set of interesting, thought-provoking things. I put on this slide just a quick little sort of extra reading list for any of you who might be interested in sort of a bit more about Byzantium in general, more or less sort of in order. And again, some of you, as I may have read all of these already, I don't know. You've got Byzantium, Surprising Life of the Medieval Empire by Judith Herron. This is great. In particular, it has things like Why We All Use the Fork. It's a Byzantine thing, and has a lot of these sort of little anecdotes for sort of why this is important to us today. Come up recently, The New Roman Empire by Anthony Caldelis. If you basically sort of hear a podcast on Byzantium, that sort of thing, Caldelis is often your pop historian over from America who talks about these sorts of things. And so that's sort of also well worth a read. He's very provocative in his arguments, which is fun. From the Holy Mountain is one of William Dalrymple's first books. I mean, he's recently much more into India, but his sort of, as a young man, he basically sort of walked from the Holy Mount Athos in Greece all the way around the Med, round to Alexandria. And this is sort of quite fun as a travelogue and historical explanation, so that's also well worth a read. Byzantium Trilogy by John Julius Norwich. I remember being told as an undergraduate, if you're really interested in Byzantium, read it. It's a wonderful novel, never cite it. It is much more of a historical novel in some ways than it is sort of good history, but it is wonderfully written. I mean, in some ways, he's the last of the medieval chroniclers, is another thing I was told on that. But it is sort of wonderful to read in particular. If you want something more academic, the Cambridge History of the Byzantine Empire is sort of fantastic for sort of little essays on different topics. But otherwise, read something that's a real Byzantine text. I mean, the Alexiad by Anna Komnene, so the princess historian. This is kind of the daughter of Alexius, which is in a new translation edited by Peter Frankopan, another Worcester man I said I brought up earlier. So this is definitely well worth a read. And finally, of course, if you want a little bit more from me, there is my own book, which comes in a lot of this stuff that I've talked to you about today. Otherwise, I'm more or less dead on target for sort of 5:50 p.m. So this has been nicely timed from me. I look forward to questions and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Max. Spectacular. And that we thanks to your timeliness, we have 15 minutes of questions. I'm a Don, so I'm not sure about how Zoom works, but there's a, if you there's a Q&A button on the bottom, and if you click it, it opens a space where you can write in your questions. So please don't hesitate to do that. While you're gathering your thoughts, Max, I thought I would ask you, in a slightly devil's advocate kind of way, does Byzantium exist in the sense that I mean the tour that you gave us of kind of 1500 years to kind of begin with, those are, I mean, each slide is arguably a different empire. Um, um, and so one can maybe ask about its powers of reinvention, and in a sense the power of narrative that you spoke about, especially in the context of kind of IS, I think is going to have a lot to do with that. But are they, to quote you, are they actual Romans, or are they kind of a series of, again, to quote you, elites and foreigners? You know,
Fantastic question. I mean, this is one of those things, if you read the Caldelis book, he's really into identity stuff. Are they Romans? When are they Romans? How are they Romans? So, I mean, one of the main things with Byzantium is is that unlike China, which has, you know, your full dynasties, I mean, so if you do Chinese, you know, here is Ming China, you know, here is, you know, so this is this long dynasty. Because Byzantium never really does the father to son thing in the same way, therefore we don't really have proper dynasties. I mean, if we did, then we'd probably much more readily talk about this period Rome. And yes, and we could obviously probably go all the way back to Augustus on this. So really talk about dynasties in the same way. And these, because obviously, you know, no one would say that Ming China is the same as Tang China. I mean, these are very different states, how they operate, even though it's still sort of operating in roughly the same geographical space. They do draw on each other. There is obviously a legacy there, and different dynasties resurrect different parts of different previous dynasties. All the way to modern China kind of thing. So in some ways, because there isn't a full dynasty system, this stops us looking at Rome in the same way as China. Otherwise, I mean, again, this is one of those things that sort of waxes and wanes. I mean, you have sort of things like, I mean, your Saurians coming in, you've got Armenians coming in, who very much are your kind of, as I said, foreigners, elites from other places who happen to put themselves on the top. And, you know, few things differently. Could there have been a Serbian dynasty, a Bulgarian dynasty, this sort of thing, incorporating those in? Oh, absolutely. Likewise, I mean, this Latin Empire, had that been a bit more successful, you would have just ended up with some proper Westerners on top, and the thing might have just continued, possibly. Slowly adopting, in the same way the Mongols conquering China, you know, the Mongols sort of ended up becoming Chinese in various different respects, taking on aspects of the empire themselves. But otherwise, I mean, there are things that keep coming back. So in my period, 12th century, I mean, you have suddenly they do the first sort of, triumph in classical Roman style for hundreds of years. You still have chariot racing going on. You still have the baths going on. You still have the libraries and the continuous tradition. So, I mean, from Constantine at least, you do have this continuity, this sort of senators. You do have, as I said, this sort of continuous, as I said, both political tradition, city-state tradition. I mean, arguably, if the rest of the empire disappeared around them, there was still this sort of, here is the city and we are the citizens of that city, continuing all the way through. Obviously, I definitely would agree that there was no such thing as a Byzantine necessarily. They called themselves Romans all the way through. That only comes across, into historiography much later. And at various points, it does seem that the rest of the empire can disappear, but we're from the city. But otherwise, I think this is again one of those templates that historians have put on it, which, if we did treat it a little bit more like China, would probably make more sense. And the other thing, of course, being that there's no modern Byzantium. I mean, modern Greece is not Byzantium, nor is modern Turkey in various ways. And this obviously means that it's seen as this kind of exotic lost world in a way that probably it shouldn't be if there was a modern state of it. If that semi-answers your first question.
Thank you. Yes. No, and then there's one of the questions in the happily growing band. Byzantine Empire is often said to last to 1453, but it's a bit of a stretch at the end when it's just the size of Wales. So I don't know if you wanted, don't know if you wanted to comment on 1453 as a moment, what actually ends there.
Sure. I mean, I will say, so in defense of Wales, that I mean, Wales is a state, and so fair enough that it continues in many ways. Yeah, I suppose this is one of those debates that, I mean, whenever you get sort of Byzantinists sitting around over a glass of wine at a conference, this comes up, is that, the late Antiquists think, oh, after Justinian, it's all downhill and it's not really Romans after Justinian. I've heard the same about Constantine. And I mean, usually I'd say sort of 1204 I think that's quite defensible as a sort of end, because exactly as I was just saying, you have the capital with chariot racing and triumphs and libraries and, this sort of continuity in the capital all the way through to 1204. After 1204, there is a break, and you have, as I said, something quite different, because the Latin Empire is unsuccessful and tries to do different things. Therefore, it isn't continuous. And then you have this sort of reconquest from one of the successors. However, even so, had the Latin Empire been more successful, we would just talk about the Latin dynasty that just happened to come in. In the same way, we do talk about England being England under Harold Godwinson. It's not a different England when William the Conqueror comes in, necessarily. There is a continuity of various political, even, there's sort of a parliament rather than a wit and gamut sort of thing. There is a continuity of England, even though it's a very different sort of England. So I don't know. I definitely have argued in the past that I think we should see it as Roman until 1204 at least. Until 1453, I think I could probably see my way round to saying, okay, yeah, it's sort of more of a successor kingdom. But from my England example there, we wouldn't say it's a very different England at that point afterwards, or indeed after, say, the Glorious Revolution, to go sort of much down the road or something, after post Cromwell or something. Is it a very different England? I mean, yes and no. There is continuity here, if that semi answers that question.
Thank you. Another question about methodology. During your on-location visits, would you say you relied more on an archaeological lens or local historiography to further your knowledge?
Mm. Also, great question. So, obviously, particularly this varies a little bit country for country. So, Turkey in particular is particularly under the current government. You need to have local partners in order to do any actual digging. Um, Even sort of measuring something is a little bit borderline. And so when it came to Turkey, if I was sort of myself, maybe a sort of research assistant or two or a colleague or two, we had to be a little bit careful, shall we say, about what we were actually doing. And so therefore there was a lot more use of things like Google Earth, obviously calculating measurements, all this kind of thing, and so rarely actually picking something up. Occasionally I did manage to, so the Bela Kasir example, I did partner with somebody at the local museum, which is quite helpful. But otherwise, yeah, you are kind of, I mean, my language skills are now very good at kind of where is the old castle in about 10 different languages, because you have to basically sort of, okay, I've got this kind of maybe I don't know, 1850s French account of a traveler who happens to have seen this place once. And then maybe there's a kind of 1950s grainy photograph of something else, but then no one's ever really looked at it since. So going to the local museum is fantastic. The British Institute at Ankara was sometimes very helpful on some of the sites because they also had a record of somebody traveling to these things. Generally, I'd say there is a bit of a rule of thumb where if it is a nice place on the beach with a decent bar, then it's quite well studied. Things like near Antalya, all of the sites around there are really, really well studied. Antakya as well, unsurprisingly, very well studied there. Whereas, sort of, say, on the North Black Sea coast, Trabzon kind of thing, is, a little bit more bleak at various points. Equally, you've got to travel a long way. I mean, Ani is wonderful. I mean, the sort of the Armenian city there. But I mean, it's a good 6 hours in the car in order to get there if you can find it, over quite rough terrain. And so these things are much less well studied. So when it comes to methodology, really, it depends a little bit on the region. Local museums are very much your friend because usually there's somebody somewhere who's done something. Little institutes, things like the British Institutes, American Institutes, French Institutes, these sort of things tend to have done something. Otherwise, a good friend are things like traveler accounts from the 19th century. Following, because often they do have, oh, this many days journey. Oh, I followed this mountain for this many days and then turned right kind of thing. This occasionally is useful. And so you're kind of doing an X marks the spots thing a little bit in order to find these things. Me, when I find it, then I put down, sort of the longitude and latitude so we can find it again. And then I can look up the Google Earth and everything else. But otherwise, it is a bit of a treasure hunt sometimes, I'll be honest.
Thank you. Possibly rhetorical question: is Byzantium Tolkien's Minas Tirith? What do
Ooh.
you think about
It's
that?
an interesting one on this. So, Tolkien, I mean, there was a bit of scholarship on this. I mean, I'm not the expert necessarily on it, but did not really think much of your Romans and particularly Byzantium.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously he's much more into Anglo-Saxons. I mean, hence, the sort of the heroic Rohan people, all this kind of stuff. Whereas, Gondor is this sort of, decadent, fallen people obsessed with death and monuments. Again, there's a bunch of stuff written. I mean, Avril Cameron, sort of great Byzantinist from Keble, sort of has written a bit on this as well. That in particular, kind of Tolkien was not a fan of sort of classical Rome or Byzantium for this sort of reason. Is this sort of had this sort of decadent, dying culture that then had to be sort of rejuvenated with sort of heroics of Anglo-Saxon equivalents. Looking at that, so yes, in some ways it is, but not in a positive sense, if that's a short answer. But otherwise, I recommend you to Avril Cameron's books.
Great. Then there's a couple questions coming in about religion. So the first one is asking about the mainsprings of this resilient empire. How important was religion? How flexible were they in their
Mm,
constitution? And the next one goes, you mentioned there were mosques in Constantinople
mm,
before the collapse of the empire. Can you tell us more about the Muslim presence
mm.
at the time, when it started and how and why it happened? So that's since There's a little
Sure.
passage there.
So how important was it? So there is debate over this. I mean, so there was a lot of in Oxford in particular, a lot of kind of emigre Russian scholars who basically fled communism, kind of like came over sort of to Oxford in particular, and therefore they often portrayed kind of Byzantium as sort of either Tsarist Russia mixed with, to be honest, modern USSR, with a sort of very totalitarian government where they effectively swap either the Tsarist kind of equivalent or indeed communism for basically this sort of massive religious. So if you read any older books, Vasiliev, this sort of Ostrogorsky, these sorts of books from the 1970s onwards, yeah, if you go to your local library, this is the kind of thing they'll have. I'm not saying it's wrong, but they very much emphasize that, Byzantium is this sort of, mystical sort of theocracy. I mean, there's very much sort of books like sort of King and Priest, sort of very much, this is a theocracy in some ways. More modern books tend to downplay this a little bit. I mean, Caldelis goes a bit too far by saying that, oh yeah, they do God talk, but actually, they're not really that serious about it. The truth is, as ever, sort of a little bit in the middle, and we are talking about a state that lasts 1500 years, and so this goes up and down a lot. The impression you get at various points is that, on the street corner, they're talking about the chariot racing results, and then they're talking theology, and just, oh, do you support this particular, great speaker in, in this particular church, or how about that one? You have these major theological debates over the use of images, for example, this sort of thing, which do seem to really kind of, get everyone involved. I mean, from the top to bottom. This isn't necessarily a top-down thing or a bottom-up thing. So, yeah, this does seem to be a major factor at times, and then less of a factor at other times. You oddly enough have, as I said, this Roman imperial tradition continuing. This semi bleeds into the next question as well, whereby you have a bit like China. This is the one world empire, even if we're not physically ruling everyone else. There is one god above, there is one emperor. This is the earthly state in which, sort of the order of the universe should be. And this only makes sense if, therefore, you are tolerating other peoples. I mean, you can't really be an empire without other peoples that you are ruling over, as such. And therefore, there's a book called Rough Tolerance, which I think probably sums it up quite well, actually, whereby you have inverted commas heretics. I mean, there's this guy called the Paulicians, for example, that don't really believe in priests at various points, with an army regiment. This is obviously, your sort of Byzantium Orthodox state should not really like these people, and yet they're happily having them in the army, with their own commanders and everything else. Likewise, Armenians. I mean, they also sort of have a very different church going on, and yet they're absolutely sort of existing in the empire. And so particularly when it comes to Muslims, this gets interesting. So in some way, obviously, again, 1500 years to play with, so there's a lot of variation here. But after your initial invasions, because I mean, there's 3 great sieges, possibly 2, depending on the historiography, of Constantinople by your caliphate armies. After that, and the initial drive back, effectively, the caliphate slots into the position that Persia previously had. So whereby, there is kind of, okay, we're the empire over here, and the way over there is China, and there is a little bit of contact between everyone. And in the middle, there is Persia. And so they refer to the Arabs as the Persians. And there is this continuity from the kind of, Zoroastrian Persian thing going on, except now with the Caliph. And so you have your sort of Caliph in Baghdad, sort of filling this new role. And so there is a certain amount of respect. They have mass prisoner exchanges. And in particular, the first mosque in Constantinople was put up effectively for prisoners of war, who were being relatively well treated, it seems, enough so that they can ransom them back or wait until there's a major prisoner exchange. This appears to have been the first one. And then this is still around in 1204, as when the sort of Crusaders show up sort of there. And initially, so they're just sitting in the capital waiting for more money, getting drunk the whole time. And one of the main things that annoys them so much is there are actual Muslims and mosques there. They've come all the way from Western Europe to fight the heathen Muslims, inverted commas, and then they've got this mosque on the street right there, and then this is one of the things that causes one of the major riots and fires and everything else. So yes, there seems to have been, as I said, this sort of major Muslim presence more or less from the beginning. That continues. You also have, particularly with Fatimid, that is Shia Egypt, quite a lot of sort of friendliness there. Sort of against basically the sort of Sunnis. So there's a little bit in particular sort of Shia sort of Byzantine sort of affinity, shall we say. So it's also quite nuanced between the bunch. I mean, I can talk a lot more about this, but generally, hopefully that semi-answers the question. Before we move on to the next one, I think about Jews from what I see.
Thank you. Yes, no.
Yeah.
I mean, let me. I mean, we've worked you hard enough. I think
Mm,
maybe these final two. The pass. Someone, do you know the passage from Mishnah Rosh Hashanah
mm,
2:2, in which we learn that the Jews in Jerusalem had to give up their beacon bonfire system
mm,
that told them when the new month was beginning, because the Samaritans would fire up the beacons at the wrong time to confuse the Jews. Maybe another reason for the
mm.
Byzantine beacon system ending, and then. Another suggestion, the University of Oxford became embryonic at the seminal Byzantine date of 1204. Is Oxford the new Byzantium?
Uh-huh. Uh, Too quick. I mean, I know we're running out of time, so I suppose a quick answer to the first one. Though I'm not familiar with that passage. I mean, I have done a bunch of stuff on particularly sort of Deuteronomistic material from, as I said, Jewish scripture, because particularly at various points, you have this kind of Byzantium viewing sort of the books of the prophets as prophecies about them. Because you have a lot of interesting things whereby your sort of equivalents of the Chaldean horsemen or Babylon, etc., coming in and sort of taking, so particularly your post Rehoboam, that is for everyone else in the sort of, this is sort of Solomon's son, so grandson of King David. Obviously your kind of your initial united kingdom of Israel splits into kind of sort of into a north and south. And then at this point, there's a lot of material in sort of the Old Testament as sort of in Christianity, talking about how a righteous remnant remains that will one day reunite the United Kingdom of Israel. And of course, Byzantium is looking at this thinking, oh, this sounds just like us, really. Sort of the new Chaldeans, the Turks, et cetera, at various points. So that would be very interesting. I mean, I might actually look up later, just like if that is used. There's a lot of basically, it's an odd chicken or the egg. I mean, are they reading the Old Testament and then doing it, or basically does something happen? Then they read the Old Testament and say, like, oh, look, it's prophecy. So that's sort of a very interesting idea that possibly is a good case there. As for
It's Oxford the new Byzantium.
mm,
We can
sure,
we shall see.
indeed,
Um,
yeah.
but no, thank you, Max. I think we should release you at this juncture. Um, uh, the recording of this lecture will be go on email to everybody here tomorrow morning. We can look forward to the next one on February 12th, when Jennifer Walsh will be speaking about 13 ways of looking at AI, art, and music. So
Ended.
we look forward to that. um, but Max, thank you so much. I mean, you bring us the Witch of Endor, but you conjured so much yourself today, both Byzantium, both in its distant past, but also in its kind of alluring, also in some ways alarming present. So thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. Bye
My
bye.
pleasure. I hope to meet you in another history event at some point, everyone on the call. Thank you.